So my name is Michael Casey. I am recently appointed as the Chief Content Officer at CoinDesks, which is a bit of a return to journalism for me. I was at the Wall Street Journal for a long time, Dow Jones and the Wall Street Journal. I fell into the Bitcoin rabbit hole in around 2013. Sort of probably got the first words of Bitcoin into the Wall Street Journal, and then ran a column called BitBeat with a guy called Paul Vigna, and the two of us wrote a book called The Age of Cryptocurrency. By that stage, I'd totally bitten the bug, or was bitten by the bug, and I threw it all in and went off to MIT, where I was a researcher at the Digital Currency Initiative there for a while, working on some climate change stuff that the guy next door, Martin Weinstein, was just talking about, which is kind of fun because he got involved in it. Anyway, but I spent most of my time just obsessing with media because that's where I came from, and so like Michael Corleone and the Godfather, it sucked me back in, and here I am back all this time again back at CoinDesk. But it's a fun job because I've been tasked really with kind of what, in some respects, this title that Emily suggested for me is all about. We see this big opportunity to actually get this narrative out there. Somebody a little while ago was talking about the aha moments and how there's a whole realm of human beings who haven't yet had that aha moment. And in some respects, CoinDesk's mission is to reach that, what we call discovery audience. So it's really about building the tent, making it wider, incorporating people. But there's big challenges in this. And it's not just an educational story. There's all these aspects to the way that the communities who currently occupy this world, and that means business characters, but also means developers, it means Hyperledger communities, but it also means the broader crypto community, how they're organized and how they behave, and the challenges that poses to stepping outside and widening the tent. So this is what I'm really going to talk about. But I thought it might be fun just to start with a little descriptor of one of the things we experienced today, which is just par for the course, and it's kind of life as CoinDesk on Twitter. Seeing what it's like to be a journalist and getting the world thrown at you on Twitter, in the crypto Twitter world, because it's just a way to frame what I'm trying to say here. And what's interesting about this is we put out a huge, well, by our standards, fairly large stack of stories all today, because today, of course, was Super Tuesday, on this election package. And why are we doing that? Because CoinDesk is currently trying to, as part of this effort to widen the tent, reach the discovery audience, produce more articles on what we call crypto adjacencies, topics that really are not necessarily about crypto or blockchain, but are just help us to understand what problems we're trying to solve. I like coming to Hyperledger events because you're all trying to do real world problems, and those are the things that are kind of interesting in some respects as to how we drag that audience in because they can relate to them. So we're using the election as a prism, if you like, through which to look at these issues. And so we've written articles about candidates and the way that they perceive things like privacy and what they think about the digital currencies, like China's digital currency and Libra. Should there be policy responses to that? And sort of putting it all in those contexts, and how do they think about these core issues that ultimately the decentralized solution is trying to resolve, right? We think our politicians should be thinking about these issues because they are very, very important. Anyway, that's the context. So anyway, there's this one story that went out. Bernie Sanders has never been close to delivering a revolution in American life. How will he address personal privacy, cryptocurrencies, big tech? Well, Benjamin Powers, our reporter, wrote this piece. It's a good piece. It just basically lays out, as any good campaign piece would do, what are the details, what does he say, what does he think, what does he not? Of course, the responses are, I've done the right thing by blacking out the names, because even though this is a public forum, I thought, doxing, whatever. So this person says, a Bernie and DNC supporter working for CoinDesk under the cover of journalism, pushing Bernie socialist agenda. Great, really fair and unbalanced. And basically, he then puts a link to Ben's Twitter feed to prove that he is actually a DNC. By the way, a DNC supporter and a Bernie supporter is kind of an interesting way to be. What a bunch of communist CoinDesk saying Bernie has never been close to delivering a revolution. Anyway, so the point is, and this is Ben. Our reporter. Yeah, clearly a communist, right? He's He's pushing privacy. That's what all those communists are all about. Those pro-privacy communists. So ultimately, this is the kind of level of discourse. But just to take a little bit further, well, this one's not sort of attacking Ben. It's just sort of the answer to that question. What's Bernie going to be like? Well, Bernie will be anti-tech, anti-crypto, anti-candidate. He will regulate it to hell and call it greed. Marxists like him need a big central bank. He's going to ruin Bitcoin. Nightmare. This is going to be terrible, terrible, terrible. And then this guy's like, Bernie's revolution is centered around bringing back power to the people. He is Bitcoin in the flesh. And then this person here is like, long Bernie. And you do it here at FTX. I don't know how you take a long position on Bernie via FTX, but maybe they've got some cool new crypto derivatives that allow you to bet on the election. The point being, there's multiple people within this community, right? It's not monolithic, but it is really kind of divided and antsy. Now, first lesson anybody who's been on Twitter knows is you don't take that little subset of the world to be a reflection of everything. But nonetheless, it's an inherent part of the way we filter the message. And the message is what's part of the opportunity, but also one of the biggest challenges we face, because messaging about what blockchain is, what crypto is critical. And Twitter is, whether we like it or not, certainly for the sort of permissionless private crypto world, it just happens to be the primary place where all the discourse takes place. So, we have this sort of divided, divisive community, and what CoinDesk is trying to say is like, how do we get away from that? CoinDesk was covering this community and doing it not for the sort of Bernie is Bitcoin in the flesh people, or for the Bernie's going to ruin everything people, but rather trying to be good journalists and cover it as it is. But our audience as we perceived it was the existing community. And we don't think that's now really what the role should be. We want essentially to be the agent, the driver of the expanding, the widening of what we call the funnel, the top of the funnel, the people who come in and discover it and start to learn and build out and really essentially bring this technology to the world so it can make a difference. Doing that is a challenge, and that's really what I'm here to talk about. So essentially, how do we expand the tent? How do we bring everybody into this great new circus tent that those of us who are already inside are having fun with? Well, first of all, again, this talks about the challenges. And as I say, I want to just stress, I'm on the technical track, but I am a journalist, and so I'm thinking of this from that perspective, which is really all about messaging and storytelling and outreach and everything else. And for those of you who are developers and techs in the audience, it's perfectly relevant to you guys. So one of the problems is this tribalism, and you saw sort of the divisiveness in those examples I gave before, but I think it manifests in the sort of public crypto world really closely tied to tokens, the value, right? So there's this awkward scenario whereby not only are you enthusiastic about a certain technology that you care about, you've got skin in the game, you've got money in it, right? So, you probably, those of you who have heard about the XRP army, for example, right? There's sort of this army of Ripple supporters who just throw as much information they possibly can. There are bots, basically, and there's a lot of sentiment-driven trading in this world. So this messaging in this space is taken to another level, where it's people have got a huge stake in whatever it is they believe in. So there's this kind of confirmation bias squared problem, almost, right? And it manifests in this divisive, fractured tribalism. So, which I don't think is constructive to the idea of a wide tent, right? You want inclusiveness. Not fractured division and sort of internecine warfare. Now, another part of it, I think in the enterprise blockchain community, I come to Hyperledger events, and it just feels very much more subdued and nice and genial, and everybody's polite, and you're all sort of not everybody's a corporate guy, but the corporate kind of culture tends to sort of feed its way through, and it's sort of it's much less tribal. It seems much more inclusive. But again, for that wider tent, I think one of the biggest problems that's coming out of this community is this taciturnity. When, by the way, I'm very thrilled. I think it's the first time I've always used the word taciturn as an adjective. I love that I could use it as a noun. So taciturnity is I think an issue here. I want the incredible stories. Brian, you and I have had conversations about a lot of the interesting things that are happening in this space, and it just doesn't. The companies themselves aren't talking about them enough, right? And I think it's part of the problem caused by these guys to some extent, right? Because there's a public perception of the word blockchain, there's a public perception of the word crypto, and a serious lack of understanding about what's actually going on, such that, you know, these Fortune 500 companies are very worried about the way that they get associated. I think that's a factor. I'm not inside, but I think there's not enough capacity to talk about these issues. You know, we hear stories as reporters about the various consortia that have had. Some have been better than others, but some that just this disunity that exists within it, which I think is, you know, a factor of governance. It's a factor of incentives. It's a factor of really, you know, establishing the right ground rules around which people participate and why they do. It's been fascinating to watch the way Hyperledger has evolved to try to get more active engagement, and I think that these sorts of things will be resolved. But clearly it doesn't help moving forward if the members of these different consortia aren't sort of really pulling their weight together. I still think that we haven't figured out what the economics are entirely. You know, I think that there is, you know, we are going to save a bunch of money is obviously a powerful idea, but who goes first and how is that distributed, and, you know, how does this, you know, I like to call it we technology rather than a me technology actually get paid out to the members is still something that I think is unresolved. I think there's all sorts of interesting opportunities around insurance and others that will eventually bring this into that world. And I just think that again, maybe partly because of the back and forth between the public and the private communities, you know, this sort of dismissiveness amongst certain people within the permissionless world that you can just use a database, this is rubbish, and unless you are like Bitcoin and you have absolute censorship resistance, then, you know, this is a waste of time and a waste of money, and that narrative just gets drilled down with I would say a lack of sophistication really, but it is nonetheless something that, again, works against this capacity to all to come together. And then there's just the broader issue of diversity, you know, I mean, you go to a consensus conference, you know, CoinDesk's flagship conference, which you are all invited to and you all should attend, you'd be crazy not to, and it's largely men, and sort of predominantly white men, right? Come to the Hyperledger conference, kind of the same, right? I mean, this is a reflection of tech, we know that, and it doesn't excuse it, but it is just a fundamental aspect of what this is all about. And I think that beyond the obvious benefits, or the benefits that most of us who think like this recognize of having diversity, the diversity of inputs, helping the greater whole, it really doesn't help the expansion of the tent because, again, this messaging, the stereotyping, everything else. I mean, it was very difficult for CoinDesk when New York City, in its infinite wisdom, decided to rent out those the parking lots. Who was at Consensus in 2018? I think you probably were, Brian. Were you there, Messina? 2018 was you were there? Craziest year for Consensus. I couldn't be there at the time, unfortunately. But there were 2 Lamborghinis parked out the front. We had nothing to do with that. We had no idea what the city was doing. It was renting out that space. But that became the defining narrative for what blockchain is, right? New York Post, everybody was talking about the Lamborghinis, and the Bitcoin bros, right? So all this gets back to this diversity story and the lack thereof, meaning that there's this narrative problem. But ultimately, at the end of the day, there's still this big learning curve barrier. People don't understand this stuff. We've really got to get better and better at explaining it. And that's really what I think I see as my role and the people who work for me, our role. We need to find ways. It's not just about explaining, it's about connecting. It's about, as I say, reaching out to story areas that are relevant, explaining the problem first, getting people to understand the structural issues that we're trying to resolve. Because I feel like people's mindsets are sort of framed to think in a sort of a centralized way. All right, so the opportunities, though. change is coming. And it's kind of coming whether we like it or not, right? China's about to launch its digital currency. Libra is, I think, going to happen regardless, despite all the naysayers. I think there is too much momentum behind it, and it is an idea that sort of time has come. And when that happens, that's a big deal. Money, we've disrupted everything else. Software is eating the world, as Mark Andreessen tells us. Well, when money is software, it's going to devour it, right? I mean, money is the essence of every aspect of our exchange, or every aspect of it. It is this sort of defining vehicle by which civilization is built. So once that becomes programmable, then, really there's going to be profound impacts from this. So I think that, in fact, I think this is really a huge opportunity for enterprise blockchain. I think there's there shouldn't be any surprises by the fact that there was a close alignment between China's announcement of its digital currency and the all-in on blockchain kind of statement that Xi Jinping came out with in October last year. They're calling it National Blockchain Day, I'm hearing from some folks in China, but that may be wishful thinking. Nonetheless, the idea that there is now a programmable token to be embedded into blockchain projects as that missing layer is, to me, something that I think really takes this to another level. And then the other missing piece, of course, is digital identity. So it's great to see so much conversation here. I think at this meeting, the sovereign guys are walking around, a lot of the different identity projects. It seems like Hyperledger is actively involved in resolving that. But again, these are the things that are coming, and I feel as if that's what's going to just push us over a layer in which these changes are going to just be inevitable, and it's where we have to actually widen the tent. And the other part of it is like, really, things are getting a bit rough. I'm Australian, so I just saw the fires, in this sort of tragic, almost, inferno-like confirmation that we are at this do-or-die moment. And it is a fundamental, universal problem that defies the centralized governance structures of our world, right? I was listening to Martin speaking over there about the climate ledger solutions that they're looking at, which inherently go with how do you coordinate when you've got completely different entities? How do we actually know what we're talking about unless there is some sort of common universal standard? And so this is where blockchain lands into this kind of really important opportunity. And then the thing that we're all talking about as well, bumping elbows around the place at this meeting, of course, I think it's really an interesting way to think about, that classic Chinese saying, a crisis is an opportunity. Because I saw this great thread the other day. Somebody was explaining, why markets collapsed last week as the fear over coronavirus became so big. And his point was that we've built no resiliency into our systems. So the internet came along, globalization came along, and everything pushed towards just in time. Everything was about efficiency. And that efficiency is all built to a centralization standard. It's company X wants to extract as much as it possibly can from its resource base. So architects, engineers are building these straight line solutions. And the problem is when something is out of whack with that, where is your slack? There's no alternative place to go, right? So I keep mentioning Martin, but he and I were working on distributed microgrid solutions in Puerto Rico. And one of the many arguments for a distributed microgrid structure is that when one of them goes down, there's another one that can come up, as opposed to a centralized grid system. And this was the case in Puerto Rico. We wiped out one generator and a few transmission lines, and the entire island goes down, right? So resiliency lies in the capacity to have multiple nodes that can come into place. This all sounds rather familiar, doesn't it, right? So this is the key problem with COVID-19. Our supply chains have got no slack. We're being reminded of the problem of the need, ironically, for inefficiency as a kind of a good in itself. And a blockchain as a model says we're going to put some friction in here so that we can actually prove that the data we're getting is accurate. And with that in place, we can start to build decentralized systems around that, which give us the slack that we need in case of other models. So there's a real connection here. I think the other thing to think about is that just reading about Singapore's apparent success, relative success in managing coronavirus. It's contained it fairly well. One argument, of course, it's a small, easy-to-manage city-state. But the other is there's absolutely zero privacy in its health records. So if you look, there is a full database of every single victim of coronavirus, when they got it, where they live, what they're doing, what their recovery rate is, all of that publicly available so that there's now a mechanism for actually managing it. Wonderful from a sort of epidemic fighting, public health planning perspective, but terrible from a privacy perspective, right? So COVID-19 is where the rubber meets the road between this core tension between the public need for information and security and the private need for privacy and for the individual rights. And at the end of the day, that's what this technology was born upon, an attempt to try to resolve that. Of course, much of it is public. Public blockchains have this problem, but there's been an incredible outpouring of research into cryptography around private zero-knowledge proofs and a whole range of new wonderful advances that have come up that really do try to allow us to have our cake and eat it too, to have provably private transactions take place. And that's what I see as the solution, right? At some point, if we can extract all of that public health data, so there's somebody else who's talking about Fitbits. Fitbits can, if Fitbits have, or any Apple Watch have a fairly early indicator with a bunch of false positives, but on an aggregate level, fairly good indicator of how an epidemic is spreading because heart rates tend to rise in advance of the other symptoms coming on. So if you could map that, you could do some fabulous things. But of course, we have to get all that data. How do we do it? Well, zero-knowledge proofs, blockchain-type models. There's a lot here that I think is relevant to this particular moment in time. All right, so as I said, this is the technical track, and I'm the journalist feeling a little bit like a fish out of water. So I just wanted just to end this to sort of think a little bit about how developers need to be thinking about the widening of the tent and the role that developers can play in making sure that this story gets wider. And I think that in some respects, the developers are and always have been the heroes of any big technical movement because they're the guys who are building the stuff, and we love and adore them and appreciate them for that. But I do think that there is a cultural barrier, and there's therefore a need. I remember Patrick Byrne, some of you would know Patrick Byrne, of course, one of the most interesting people in the crypto space. He once told me that he speaks Dolphin. That's his skill. He speaks Dolphin because techies speak Dolphin, and I speak English, but I speak a little bit of Dolphin, and therefore I can do this because I can translate between the two of them. So I think I'm a little bit of a Dolphin speaker. I think the role of allowing for the sort of the non-technical people to be engaged in these conversations, to find ways to outreach to the C-suites, to the outside communities, to regulators, to everybody, to be open, not just pushing your marketing guy out in front, but literally ensuring that the right messages are going through, that the right taxonomy is being used, right? There's so much confusing language around blockchain that it just feeds into misunderstandings, and that's where I think you get the bursts and bubbles, because now everybody thinks blockchain's just a bunch of crypto kids in Lambos, right? So developers who are at the heart of this and understand the technology need to be able to outreach. I think that's a key point. And I think there is, the thing that I find fascinating about this technology is that because it is dealing inherently with trust and trust barriers, it is a social technology. And I think there's an instinct amongst engineers to dismiss anybody who's coming in and saying, we need governance, or we need, there's an automatic dismissiveness of anyone who's coming at it from outside the engineering world who sees something magical in it, because you don't understand the actual architecture of this thing. But in fact, it really doesn't work, in my mind, without this really interesting social dynamic, right? It's playing with incentives all the time. So Bitcoin is a wonder for the fact that it figured out that human beings act in a certain way. It's not an innate aspect of the architecture that you are incentivized not to double spend or to sort of, do a 51% attack, right? It's about our nature, our human nature, that we have some interest in this and we don't want to lose it. Proof of stake is a similar idea, right? So these are human traits. These are aspects of who we are and how we relate with each other. And that's a critical part of what the actual entire system is and how it functions. So I really want to see how we can figure out a better communication layer between that developer phase and the rest of us, lesser mortals outside of that circle. That interface, that conversation, is critical to how we move this thing to a wider tent. So that's it. What I can tell you, just because I'm here as a little bit of a pitch, I'm as I said, I'm a journalist. I run a team of journalists, but I'm also here to just let everybody know that we're here. We're getting bigger, and I have a mandate to grow CoinDesk significantly. We think that we have a chance. The transformation of the financial system, the transformation of the architecture of the global economy needs a trusted, reliable news organization, a media outfit that can tell that story and be part of it. A little bit like the Wired, if you like, of the early days of the internet. And so this is a unique, small window of opportunity we have to grab that space before suddenly Bloomberg wakes up and says, I'll have that, thank you very much. So that's my job, is to get out there and grow. So it's exciting for me. I've never been in a media organization where I actually get to grow an organization, to employ people, to expand across the world and tell this, really, the by far most interesting story in finance for, I would say, a century. So it's a big deal. I don't know if anybody has any questions. You can happily ask me some, but that's essentially the end of the talk. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? Yes?
You say this bigger tent on top to get some of your ideas to get people in.
Yeah, great, good, glad you asked. So, so basically, as we're calling it, crypto adjacencies as a topic, right? So that's one of the key strategies, is to say, so just to give you an example, when the coronavirus meltdown in markets was happening last week, like, we looked at it and said, right, what we would normally do is we would just look at the price of Bitcoin, which was moving around on that, and write the story about the price of Bitcoin. And then, of course, the reason would be coronavirus. But really, the most important radical thing happening, it wasn't Bitcoin. It was a small player. So we wrote the story of the markets collapsing and talked about that, and then found that as a way to get into the conversation about, is Bitcoin a hedge? What is the role, right? So we looked at that from questions about, the market and its structure, and then started asking deeper questions about the role of Bitcoin and all of that. Another story that came out last, which I think was just to give you another example, a lot of the blockchain companies were starting to say, all right, so we've got our distributed workforce, we're okay, we can much more easily lock everything down because we don't have the problem of these offices where everybody has to meet. But then, so that's one way to look at the stories, to say, what are blockchain companies doing? But we thought, no, here's a really interesting way to talk about the future of work, right? So I'd interviewed Harry Moseley from Zoom when I was at Davos, and it was like, why is Zoom's CIO talking to CoinDesk? And the answer was, because you're about the future of work. You've got decentralized organizations. That's what this is about. So we can sort of see what we call it the lens of decentralization, and applying that to otherwise non-crypto stories. And that's another example. So we're doing that. I think I'm going to hire a central bank reporter who covers central banks, right? And yes, they'll try to do it in the context of the future digital currency, but they're there as a central bank reporter. We've hired a privacy reporter, write about privacy, one of the most important issues of our time. Digital media, there's just so many other ways you could go. Cambridge Analytica was a CoinDesk story as far as I'm concerned, right? That's the way I'm trying to think about that. Yeah, I hope that just answered the question. Yes? Sure.
So the four terms, like the blockchain, utility, crypto, and programming term by a
What's the last one, sorry? Multi-party computation? System, multi-party systems, right, yeah.
What is your, like, it's a bigger tent that you're there, right?
Yeah.
Everything is same, but everybody has a different emotion attached to the word.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. Well, you heard me as well, so the taxonomy is confusing, right? We've never really zeroed down on this. And we ran a column yesterday by Preston Byrne, who's a lawyer in this space, and he was just criticizing all of the different states and the fact that their definition of a blockchain varied, and some of it was too broad to mean anything. One of them was too narrow, and like these definitions, no one's really sorted them out. I don't know the answer because we have to use language and we have to be precise. I feel as if in the same way that there are standards bodies sort of coming together to figure out what technical standards are needed, we almost need them for blockchain. So for example, like, is China's digital currency a cryptocurrency? Can I see a show of hands? Is it a cryptocurrency? So like, it's centrally run by a central bank, right? And so why would you call it a cryptocurrency? Well, I tend to think not, because I think inherently we must think of these sort of natural native tokens on decentralized systems to be that. But the thing is, China's digital currency is nothing like Venmo or PayPal or Alibaba. It's literally a cryptography-based system. It's a distributed ledger. And it's managed as a unique digitally scarce asset in the same way that Bitcoin is. So it has so many attributes. It's closer to Bitcoin than so many other things. But it happens to be issued, and its issuance is managed by a central bank. Why isn't that a cryptocurrency? It's cryptographically managed, and it's a cryptography that turns it into. So does crypto mean cryptography, or does it mean cryptocurrency, right? So this is where we're at, and what we use popular meanings and technical meanings, and I literally don't know the answer. But you've really highlighted a major problem, because without that, the communication is challenging. I think that's very true.
Sounds like you have multiple.
Yeah, it's funny you say that, Emily, because we often wonder about how might we imagine consensus in the future? How big, like a decentralized consensus. It's just all over the place, rather than everything all in the one hotel, right? So, yeah, multiple tents isn't a bad idea.
I'm not sure it's good. That's not a lot of
No, there's not. It does it actually. I mean, for that it does. But this metaphor will not. We're trying to get everyone involved, and it ends up like the fragmented tribalist system. So, in that sense, no. Yeah.
But if you try to define like a definition in terms of the capabilities, and then you see that there's a commonality between all these keywords or four words, whatever you want to call it, right? Because there will be a layer with family network, security, then consensus or staking, right? So if you define these terms, then it doesn't matter what you do.
Yeah. Who's going to do the defining?
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're right. I think that I imagine like one way to think about how this is different from what the early days of the internet was all about. I always think those guys at DARPA and Stanford and everywhere else, the early days of ARPANET, they had the pure luxury of building in virtual anonymity. No one knew what they were doing other than a bunch of nerds, right? You guys are having to build this stuff with the eyes of the world on it and demanding a return now, right? Whether it's corporate investors in Hyperledger consortia projects or holders of crypto tokens, the demand is now. So I think that feeds into the definition, because it's not just the technicians sitting down there and figuring out what it is that they're building and therefore the words to define it. It's the market taking those words and using them and abusing them. And so, yeah, it's a messy process. I mean, I think this is what's obviously dangerous but also interesting about it, right? Because all language historically emerged in that kind of way, I imagine, right? There wasn't a committee that decided that this is going to be called a table. Somewhere along the line it became the standard, right? So anyway, this is just a tangent. Anybody else? Yes?
What do you think the most important story that people in our space and in this conference should be following that we aren't paying enough attention to?
All right. I think it's the programmable money impact of China's digital currency, and how it might feed into blockchain works, how it challenges the potential hegemony of the dollar. I'm very interested by the idea, and it's interesting, somebody mentioned it today, that At this stage, most of the central bank digital currencies that are being built are not contemplating a cross-border situation. They're only looking at internals. But what happens when one fiat digital currency reaches, one country reaches an agreement with another one's currency, and there's an interoperable standard by which they create an atomic swap, and you've now got smart escrow arrangements, and so that an importer and an exporter can lock in the rate at which they exchange and have those funds separated at that moment. You don't need the dollar anymore. It ceases to be relevant because it's only there at the trade level to hedge against that loss, right? So that to me is a pretty powerful concept, that the very idea of reserve currency goes away. So, and I think that feeds into everything else that we do. Money it makes the world go round. It's going to plug itself into all of these. A digital programmable token is going to be a game changer. So I think there's not enough, people are talking about it, but I don't think people are talking about the breadth of impact that will come from that. So that'd be the number one. I just generally would love to see you guys talking more about the various projects that are coming. I think, this isn't quite answering your question. It's just that I think there is a lot of untold stories in enterprise. Generally, I've heard companies say we would talk about this, but we don't want to because we're afraid that we'll get whatever as a result of it. So I'd just love to see folks. Nope. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's part of the consortium problem as well, I suppose, right? Just getting everybody to the table and signing all those NDAs and then locking themselves down makes it very hard.
And I do think, we see these all brands today, who have been in the community for a very long time and have decided strategically not to make a big splash about what they were doing and how they were doing it because they wanted to rebuild the competency in-house, to make sure that it's the right thing for the business. And then, you have to respect that.
Yeah.
It's just a cycle. You never try to walk the cycle.
Yeah.
I tell people all the time, smart people trying to sell enterprise blockchain solutions, and they have an open enterprise one day in their lives, and I love those conversations. It's like, yeah, go for it. But it's different beast.
Yeah.
Software is a completely different beast than the fiat market.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think, to some extent, it's an attempt to rebuild that kind of little closed ARPANET community, right? And do it without the public glare. And yeah, there's that expression, biddle, right? A lot of people were celebrating the fact that the collapse in the crypto price market suddenly created some space for the developers to start building without getting upset about it. So I think you're absolutely right. I just naturally want more transparency. This is the nature of a journalism. It's always the antagonism companies and journalists always have, like, tell me what you're doing. And so the instinct on our side is to get it out. And I do think that it's hard to invite others in at this stage when it doesn't seem like nothing's going, when it seems like it. The prevailing wisdom is blockchain is dead. Literally see that written so many times, which of course is absurd. But it's hard to get that, new flood of adoption, the widening of the tent, if we're not even talking about it.
Enterprise networks, and they can't talk about what they do, right? And the customer will talk about what they do, but the work is happening.
Yeah.
You see it at the developer level, you see it at the services providing level. And we love to make sure that that aspect of it, we've done market growth. And I think, IDC gave Webster, not today's presentation, but he's done it, where he's shown there is commercial
Right.
growth in the market for technology providers and service providers as well.
Yeah, and I think it's something that people can understand. They see a product, they start to, it becomes a a translatable concept.
Otherwise, it's beautiful code, it's really happy developers.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think the developer, kind of part of the, my thinking is that having to get more developers, as you grow the developer community,
Right.
and getting people who are passionate about all the communities who want to build enterprise apps.
Right.
That's where it's at.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're absolutely right. That's yeah, the developer community is huge, and it's still largely focused on building those centralized, just-in-time systems, those nice, efficient, no slack, no resiliency systems. How do we get them interested in a completely different architectural structure? That's a really good point. I mean, yeah, so the language, again, is that dolphin speaking, right? So how do you, you're selling it to the wider community, but then how do you sell it to that community that actually should be more accessible, but is busy doing something else? Okay? Great. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming.